All right, everyone, welcome to this week's WRS, Water Resources Science Graduate Seminar. Today we have with us Dr. Amit Pradhananga, and he is with the Center for Changing Landscapes. I'll let you take it away. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Tracy. So my name is Amit. I am a social scientist. I am a research associate with the Center for Changing Landscapes and the Department of Forest Resources. Can everyone hear me well enough? Okay. All right. And I study human behavior, so human environmental behavior, how people make decisions about um, adopting conservation practices or being involved in their communities in terms of environmental actions. I've done studies mostly around water resources, but I've also worked on areas of invasive species, climate change, parks and trails. So I try to cover different types of natural resource issues. But most of my work is around water resources. And a lot of the work is focused on connecting with farmers and landowners and doing community assessments, trying to understand what landowners and farmers think, believe, and what types of social psychological factors affect their decision-making process. So that's kind of what I'll be talking about here today, providing kind of an overview of different research projects that I've been involved in. Let's see if this thing works. Do I have to? Cancel this. Do you know if I close it, does that stop it? All right, now it's working. All right, it's working now. All right, so here's kind of the problem that I'm focusing on is water impairments in Minnesota, particularly focused on non-point source pollution. According to the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, about 40% of all water bodies that are assessed in Minnesota for impairments, about 40% of those are impaired. For all kinds of pollutants, there may be E. coli, fecal coliform, turbidity, nitrates, phosphorus. In fact, my master's work was doing more of this type of work of water quality monitoring, collecting water and sediment samples and assessing them in the lab for E. coli and fecal coliform nutrients, suspended solids, and so forth. This thing is just not going on. All right. I think I have to just stop using this. So that's the point about non-point source pollution, is that it's an area that we haven't necessarily found the solution to, as opposed to point source pollution, where we have a lot of policy options and regulations that have been applied. And what I'm really asking you to do in terms of thinking about non-point source pollution, and the way I think as a social scientist about water pollution and water issues in general, is I think of them as social issues. Because the causes and consequences of water pollution are societal in nature, and the solutions also must be societal in nature. It requires individual and collective action. It requires people to use different types of practices that help address the problem of non-point source pollution, but it also requires that people become involved in their communities and work with one another to address water pollution. In particular, the current kind of management approach and regime we have is based on voluntary action. There are a set of rules and requirements, so you must have heard of the buffer law in Minnesota, that landowners and farmers are now required to have buffers along any streams, rivers that pass through their property. But by and large, this whole area of water management is based on voluntary action. So one, in terms of adopting different types of practices, so whether that's farmers using different types of conservation tillage practices, protecting wetlands on their farms, or it may be adopting buffers, having buffers around streams and rivers. And the second type of behavior that I spend a lot of time with is civic engagement, so people connecting with one another in trying to address different types of water resource problems. And this is really where this area that I do a lot of research in, the human dimensions area, comes in, because this is all really about understanding how, understanding people, right? So understanding how people connect with nature, connect with the environment, connect with water resources, what are their beliefs, perceptions, And a lot of it is really focused on how people make decisions. So what factors affect people's decision making around water protection? And within that, most of the focus is around behavior. That's in terms of the management perspective. That's what they're really concerned about, is how do we address behaviors that affect negatively our water resources, and how do we change behaviors to be more environmentally, more pro-environmental? How do we change behavior so that farmers are adopting different types of practices that help prevent water pollution issues? And so that's really the key focus of my work, is understanding environmental behavior, understanding human behavior. And so any type of intervention, so you might think of different types of conservation programs that are applied all across Minnesota, they really must be based on an understanding of the determinants of behavior. So anytime you have any programs, whether that's, sometimes there's educational and technical assistance programs, there's programs that provide cost share and financial incentives, they should all really be based on understanding what really affects people's behavior and what really gets people to take and change their behavior. And that's what I spend 80% of my time on, is trying to understand what drives conservation behavior, particularly focusing on not so much the economic factors per se, but focusing particularly on the social psychological factors. Although when working particularly with farmers, the economic factors are something that you necessarily have to consider. So what do we know about environmental behavior in general? One of the things is that behaviors are not necessarily driven by knowledge and facts. They're driven more by feelings and emotions. So I hear a lot of times from resource managers that we need to educate people so that they can take the right course of action. Well, what we know from the field of environmental psychology and human dimensions is that just providing people with facts and figures and information doesn't necessarily work. The other key thing is that there's this assumption that people only act in self-interest. So if people take actions only if there is something that they can gain out of it. However, years, in fact, decades of research have shown that that's not the only way people think. People are capable of thinking beyond self-interest. They're capable of reciprocating behaviors and thinking about the consequences of their actions for others as well. So these are kind of some findings from my area of work, is that behaviors are an expression of values. Anytime we take any action, they are a manifestation of what we deeply hold to be true about the world. So values are kind of what we think should be in the world and should be happening in the world. And these values really affect what our behaviors are. Now, it's not that every time we have a decision-making situation, we sit down and think about, all right, what are my values and what are my beliefs? But it's more of a simultaneous automatic process where you take actions, but those actions are deeply affected by your values and what you believe in. So take climate change, for example, is a huge area of research where most of the country doesn't believe in climate change, and the actions follow those beliefs and values. Behaviors are really affected by, and they're triggered by, beliefs and norms. So what someone believes about water pollution, what someone believes about climate change, and what are norms? So norms for themselves, so standards they hold themselves to, but also what are social pressures around people that really affect how people take action. So values and norms, these are things that are developed by society and interactions with others around us. And that's really where the source of behaviors really lie. So with that kind of a broader idea, I developed this. So this is actually part of my dissertation work. This social psychological model called the moral obligation model that really takes in this idea of, it's really values, and what I call activators here are actually different sets of beliefs that eventually affect environmental behaviors. My phone doesn't turn off ever for some reason, even in airplane mode. So it's really values and beliefs that affect our behaviors. And the key factor that I have here, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but the key factor I have here is called personal norm, which is feelings of personal obligation. So again, going back to these feelings, right? So we really need to know not only what people know about conservation and about water and about environment, but we need to know what do they need to feel to become more involved in water protection. So this idea of personal norm is these feelings of obligation, these feelings of personal moral obligation that people feel to do something, to take certain actions. And a lot of theory has shown that these feelings are actually activated by these sets of beliefs. So one is when people become aware of a problem. So when people become aware of water pollution and the impacts that it has on the environment and on communities and on themselves. Second, once they're aware of a problem, they must feel this sense of responsibility to do something about it. And third, there has to be some social pressure around people that leads them towards more pro-environmental behaviors. And then fourthly, they must feel that they have the ability to do something about this problem. And this kind of general idea was developed more for altruistic kind of helping behaviors. So this applies to behaviors of volunteering, for example. And the extension that I kind of make with this work is that these activators really only come into play because of these deeply held values that people have. And so values about the environment. So how do people think about the environment? How do they relate to the environment? So I have this egoistic, altruistic, and biospheric values. Essentially, biospheric value means that people value nature beyond any human use. People value nature and water resources because they believe that it just has a right to exist for its own sake. Egoistics value the environment and judge aspects of the environment based on how it affects them personally. So egoists are more likely to think and believe that or take actions only if it affects them personally. And then altruistic is about they judge aspects of the environment based on how this problem affects other people. And then there's all these ideas of cultural values, which is about how people relate to one another, how they interact with one another. So look at any setting, say a community setting. Individualistic people believe that or prioritize their own personal goals or group goals, and they want to have a very unique identity for themselves instead of being just seen as part of a community. Whereas for collectivistic people, it's more important that they identify with the community. So a lot of this work around cultural values comes from intercultural, international research that has looked at what do countries that are primarily collectivistic versus individualistic think about environmental issues and other social issues. But this is pretty applicable at kind of within cultures and within countries to look at broader tendencies of people to be more individualistic or collectivistic. The key thing with values is that it's not that someone has only one type of value. So it's not that if someone is biospheric, they stop thinking about their self. Everyone has different types of values. And the more important thing is how those values are prioritized. So given a decision-making situation, you may prioritize protecting the environment over your own personal gain. But in a different situation, those values may be flipped. All right, so that's kind of the theory piece of it. So we've done at the Center for Changing Landscapes a lot of work around different watersheds. We've covered about 14, 15 watersheds now, where we've applied quantitative and qualitative research methods. We've done thousands of surveys, hundreds of interviews to try to get at this basic idea of what drives conservation behavior, what constraints, what are barriers to conservation behavior. So we've done a lot of quantitative work, a lot of surveys. So this one in particular was up in the Red River Basin. We've also done a lot of qualitative work. Some of the qualitative work has been especially focused on trying to understand how to engage racial, ethnic, diverse communities in water resource planning. So what I have here are kind of broad brush key findings from across the research projects and across studies that we've conducted, with some specific findings on particular cases. So one broad finding is that values, beliefs, and norms drive conservation behavior. That's not surprising for social scientists that works within the social psychological world, but we've found also that people's values, how they relate to the environment, relate to water resources, their beliefs, and their norms drive conservation behavior. We have this ongoing project that's a statewide survey of residents. So we mailed out 6,000 surveys to residents across the state. Close to 1,500 responded back. And what we know from this work is that Minnesotans really do value water, and they value water for different reasons. So we asked, how much do you, how important is it? How important is protection and restoration of water for these different types of uses and purposes? And obviously, water for drinking water, water protection for future generations. You can see that over 99%, 98, 99% believe that it's moderately to extremely important to protect water for these different types of reasons. The least important reason came out to be water supply for lawns and landscaping. This is a slightly different way of looking at this idea of value and how much people actually value clean streams, rivers, and lakes. So with this set of survey questions, we found that 75% of Minnesotans see clean streams, rivers, and lakes as a very important aspect of their community. So it's really seen as not only do they value water resources, but they value it as part of their community, as an important aspect of their community. So I kind of had this a little bit about personal obligation, responsibility, and concern. Minnesotans are highly concerned about water pollution. They're highly concerned about particularly the consequences of water pollution for future generations. But data that I don't really show here, they're also really concerned about water pollution for aquatic life, for their own health, for their family's health. So generally, overall, there's a lot of concern about water pollution. They also believe that it is their personal responsibility to protect water resources. But at the same time, they also assign this responsibility to different actors, including local government, state government. They believe farmers and landowners and urban residents should all be responsible. And then there's this real sense of personal obligation, so this feeling of moral obligation that I must protect water resources and I must use conservation practices. Some data that I don't show here also shows that people do see this connection between conservation practices and improved water quality. So most respondents in our surveys say that they see this connection between water resources, that if I use conservation practices, that results in healthier, improved water quality. So you, as being mostly students in this area of work, I wanted to present, or researchers, I wanted to present a little bit more in-depth analysis of some of this work that shows that these values and activators and beliefs really affect practice adoption in particular. So recall that moral obligation model that I had. This is kind of a briefer version of it, where I'm conducting a modeling analysis using structural equation modeling. So in terms of practice adoption, so this is all out of survey data up in the Red River Basin. So in terms of practice adoption, we asked about their choices in terms of adoption of riparian buffers and conservation tillage. A set of questions tried to gauge this idea about personal norms. So an example is, I feel a personal obligation to learn more about water resources in my watershed. This idea of personal responsibility, we try to capture with these standard questions, like it is my personal responsibility to help protect water resources. Awareness of consequences is this idea that ties water resources and water resource problems with a particular impact or consequence of it. So excessive water runoff affects human health. And so these are all on a scale from 1 to 5, strongly disagree to strongly agree. And then there's different ways to try to capture values. And this thing here is blocking my model. All right, so Then next, I also try to assess ability. So this idea that people need to have ability, they need to have the financial resources, the equipment to be able to use conservation practices is really important. So we tap this idea using this example question. I have the financial resources, I need to use conservation practices on the land. And then these values are measured on a scale of importance. So how important are these following factors? So to use natural resources for personal income, that represents this egoistic value that I see some personal interest out of environmental protection. Altruistic is protecting nature for human health and well-being. Biosphere is to preserve nature for its own sake. So individualist, as I kind of try to describe it a little bit, they really want to see themselves as very different from others in their community. Whereas collectivist, it's really important that they identify themselves as part of a community. So this is structural equation modeling, where it's kind of a regression-based model where you can analyze, unlike regression, where you have a set of independent variables predicting a dependent variable. The nice thing about this method is that you can assess a chain of variables. So assess a chain of variables of values to sets of beliefs, and then looking at norms and adoption all kind of at the same time. Whereas if you did regression, you'd have to kind of break it up into multiple steps. So here are some of the findings. So all the numbers you see here are regression weights. So if you're familiar with linear regression, you'll know what that is. But I would say that the exact value of these numbers and exactly what they mean is not as important to what I'm trying to describe here. So one of the things we found out is that this idea of personal norms, this feeling of personal obligation, has a direct impact, direct effect on adoption of practices, and that these norms are then activated by this feeling of responsibility. So as people feel more responsible for water resource protection, they're more likely to feel this sense of personal obligation to protect water resources. And this other idea of ability, so people also need to have, they might have this sense of obligation, they may feel very responsible, but if they don't have the ability to do it, if they don't have, whether that's the financial resources or equipment to change what they're doing, to adopt a new practice, they're not very likely to do it, because it's very predictive of both norms and directly of practice adoption. And then one of the things we found out that was really interesting too is that when people become aware of consequences of water pollution, so what are the environmental impacts of water pollution, they're more likely to take that personal responsibility to protect water resources. In other work, we found that when people see that connection between water pollution and its impacts, they're likely to generate the sense of responsibility, one, to themselves, but also they believe that we as a community must protect water resources. And then this idea of awareness is, where does that really come from? So any belief we hold, there's theories that say that any beliefs we hold, anything we believe we know, is really based on our values. So any information that comes in and any information that we use is filtered by our values. So we're more likely to seek out and use information that aligns more closely with our own values, with what we already believe in. And these sets of relationship kind of confirm that, where this particular idea of awareness of consequences was about this connection between water pollution and its environmental impacts. So for people who are more biospheric, altruistic, so people who care more about, deeply care about the environment, but also about other people, they are more likely to become more aware of the impacts of water pollution, and they're more likely to believe that water pollution has consequences for the environment, for water quality in general, but also for other people. Whereas those who believe that, those who have this value that where only personal interest matters or takes priority over others, they're not very likely to believe that water pollution has these negative impacts. And then we found that people who are more collectivistic in nature, so people who believe that they're part of a community, who prioritize group goals over personal goals, are also more likely to believe that they should be personally responsible for protecting water resources. So this idea makes sense because, if you think about redefine water pollution away from hydrology and engineering and technology, and think of water resources as a social problem. The people who are more likely to be social in nature are also more likely to take responsibility for solving what is a collective problem. So if you think of water as a collective problem, it makes sense that people who are more collectivistic are also take responsibility for water protection. So second key finding is that there are some major constraints, right? So from this past slide, I showed this lack of ability can be something that motivates, drives, or this access to resources. So having that ability is something that drives people to take action. But if these resources are missing in communities, then that's something that can be a huge constraint. So even if people have this deep sense of conservation ethic and have these norms and morals, they are not likely to take action simply because they don't have the means to do it. So this lack of ability, and this other piece we found is the lack of community leadership. So for any collective action situation, any such as water pollution, there needs to be leadership at the community level. And most of the respondents that we surveyed believe that that piece is missing. So here's some data from Lower Minnesota and Middle Minnesota watershed, both fairly highly ag-based watersheds, so a lot of agriculture in both those watersheds. A little bit less in Middle Minnesota, but quite a bit in Lower Minnesota. In fact, over 90% of our respondents were farmers in Lower Minnesota, and this survey went out to landowners in general. So what we see here is most of our respondents, so a majority of people believe that they have the knowledge and skills they need to use conservation practices. But for most of them, what's really lacking is this financial resources and equipment. So particularly equipment. So a little over 20% believe that they have the equipment they need to use a new conservation practice. So you can see that particularly for farmers, adopting a new practice, whether that's cover crops or doing different types of tillage practices, is a risky venture. They need equipment, they need capital costs, and all of that. If missing, if there are no resources that helps them out with that, they're not very likely to take action. So Minnesotans across urban areas, rural areas. So with urban areas, we're looking at the Twin Cities. So we did a study in 3 different watersheds in the Twin Cities area. And then in rural, it's lower and middle Minnesota watersheds. So here we see at a collective level, people believe that they can make an impact in their community and in their neighborhood. They believe that farmers have the ability to work together and change land use practices, address water pollution. But what really seems to be lacking is this sense of leadership. So leadership is really lacking in communities and in neighborhoods in urban areas. So in terms of managing water resources, we're really familiar with and very comfortable with this idea of management and not so much with this idea of leadership. And they're very different things. Management is not so much focused on, as opposed to leadership, which is more focused on connecting with people. It's about enhancing people's abilities. It's about inspiring people. And that really seems to be what's lacking here. And third key finding is that local relevancy. So we need to make water resource issues relevant at a local level. And what's also missing is feedback. So a lot of actions and behaviors are based on feedback. As you get more feedback from people about your behaviors, you're likely to change your behaviors. And that piece really seems to be missing. So again, looking at urban and rural areas, most people across urban and rural area believe that water in Minnesota needs better protection. So they're really supportive of measures to protect water resources. But as you see here, particularly in urban areas, most, close to 80 to 90, over 90% of residents and landowners say that they're not very familiar with water resource issues in their neighborhood or in their communities. So this local relevancy is really missing. People do not have enough information about what water resources look like in their local communities. what we also know from this work is that of the people we've surveyed, 45 to 55% said that they're more likely to adopt new conservation practices if they had evidence that the practice improved water resources. So if there was evidence that showed practice X improves water resources, they're more likely to use it. What this really points to is this lack of feedback. There isn't that feedback loop happening between communities and between agencies and organizations and researchers that really can help make that connection between a practice and what are its benefits. And the fourth thing, and this is really important in terms of the work I do that I found, is that there's a pretty big gap between private and public sphere action. So private sphere action is things that people do on their own. So for example, adopting a new conservation practice. So for a landowner to adopt a conservation practice is within their private sphere of action, versus public sphere or collective level action is this civic engagement. So people becoming more engaged, more involved, working with others, going to meetings, participating in hearings and so forth that relate to water resources. So kind of boiling this down to a yes, no by doing a lot of recoding of the data. But generally what we see here is that a greater proportion of people say that they're likely to use different types of conservation practices like cover crops or protecting wetlands or use conservation tillage as compared to public sphere or civic actions like talking to others or working with others, attending meetings. But what we've also found is all of our surveys we ask about what practices do you currently use and what types of civic actions have you taken. Civic actions like attending a meeting or participating in water resource programs and so forth. And we consistently find that there are much greater proportions of people who are willing to and already do use practices on their land to protect water, but they're not as willing to work with others and share that information with others about water protection. And that's a huge problem, and that for me is kind of a relationship problem that people do not want to connect with one another and connect with organizations. So here's some key recommendations I have. One is, firstly, just get to know people. If you think of any relationships, the very first step is you want to get to know people. You don't ask someone on a date without getting to know them. You don't ask a farmer to sign a contract before getting to know them. So getting to know people, understanding what their values, beliefs are, what their perspectives are, where they're coming from, what are the barriers to them taking action, instead of assuming what they think or know, is a first step forward. So this was applied pretty well, this idea of values and understanding values and redesigning programs in Scott County, where I work closely with the Scott County Watershed Management Organization. We've done multiple surveys there to try to grasp this idea. So here's some, a really brief highlight of some of the findings there. We found that 93% of respondents are concerned about water pollution. 87% believe it's their personal responsibility, but only 22% think that their community has the leadership it needs to protect water resources. So what this initiated for Scott County was a total change in their whole approach to conservation, and not just designing and redesigning the program. So one of the things they did in their communication with landowners and farmers is because they're really concerned about the consequences, the social and ecological consequences of water pollution, they started focusing their communication, highlighting the social and ecological benefits of conservation. So this is what happens, what are positive impacts of using conservation practices. They also started to host events to show appreciation for people who participated in the program. So this is this idea going back to building relationships. But also this is about saying to people that you took responsibility to do this, and therefore we want to show appreciation for it. And then finally, this idea of lack of community leadership was huge. So they started promoting success stories. So they had a couple of lakes which were taken off the impaired waters list. And so they really started promoting their own success stories, but also success stories of individual farmers and landowners who adopted practices, worked with them to putting projects on their property. And the idea with sharing success stories is then it shows to people that there are things going on in community that are having a positive impact, and that there is leadership around this issue. And it's also a way to build momentum for conservation and really show to people that conservation and protecting water resources is a norm in our communities. Second is this lack of feedback. So really trying to address this idea of feedback. So providing regular feedback about environmental conditions. So not just saying the Minnesota River is one of the most polluted rivers in the whole country, but really providing more specific information about here's stretch A of the river that is around the area that you live, and here are the impacts and problems there, and here's what you can do to address that problem. So providing that feedback is really important. One of the best examples comes out of work on energy conservation, where when I check my energy bills, I can also see how much I've used, but also how much my neighbors use, and how much customers for Excel Energy, for example, use. So that's a way of providing that benchmarking information. If you're an economist, you might call it behavioral nudges, to show what others are doing compared to what you're doing, and that really builds these norms around conservation behavior. Third, it's really critical that we address these individual and collective level barriers to change. So addressing the lack of resources, but also trying to build leadership, cultivating leadership at the very local level. That shows that people are actually doing something about water resources. And you can look at these educational technical assistance programs that the goal there is to enhance people's knowledge and skills for conservation. But that in itself perhaps is not enough. There's programs like cost share programs that provide actual financial resources to put in conservation practices. The other key thing that came up was this lack of equipment. So one of the things that potentially could be done is providing equipment for, at least for the first time, participators in programs to have equipment available to them on a rental or kind of a lease basis. And then finally, and I would say perhaps most importantly, is to build trusting relationships. So building relationships with communities, building relationships with farmers and landowners. It's really relationships that get things going. So when you think about particularly farmers, adopting and using a conservation practice is risky. It's filled with uncertainty. They don't know if it's going to work. They don't. It puts new cost constraints on them. It takes money to use it. It takes money to maintain it. So given that context of risk, it makes sense that people would be more likely to take that risk with people they actually trust than people that they don't trust. One of the things we found out is the most trusted sources of information about conservation across most of our surveys have been the local soil and water conservation district. So again, the scale of management has to be local. And then it needs to support community building. So again, thinking of water not just as a hydrological water quality issue, but thinking of water really as a community issue, and how do we involve communities in water protection, and not just thinking about how do we have a project that addresses problem X or Y. Right, so as I end, I'm going to thank all these people. I don't want to name them, that's going to take too long. Thank all of them, all the funders and partners, and most of all, the participants who took the time to fill out all these thousands of surveys and sit with us for an hour, 2, 3 hours to talk through interviews and so forth. And I'll take questions. Yeah.
So I would say within the natural sciences in general, there's kind of a wall of art, natural sciences, and social sciences, and the professional realm as well. There's a lot of state money going to right now and about to be going to Watershed planning and conservation efforts over the next years or so. How can these concepts be brought into those plans to kind of bring money toward
Yeah, so I would say that, so I've been here 8 years working in this area, and when I started versus now, I've seen a lot of changes in that area. That it's everywhere I present about the social aspects, people are way more receptive. So I get a lot of requests from like geologists and hydrologists to come talk about social sciences. And in fact, quite a bit of my work with a lot of these surveys were funded through clean water funds to do a lot of the social end of the research. I think there's still a lot of that siloing, and I think it doesn't help that there's this perception of hard sciences or natural sciences versus soft sciences or social sciences. I actually usually just call it complex sciences or social sciences because it's about people and they're just complex, right? But I think there's a lot more receptiveness to this idea, and I work with state agencies a lot, and they're a lot more of them are very receptive, and I think they're also incorporating a lot of these ideas into the work they do. Um, with this new kind of one watershed, one plan approach, there's also, and in fact, this has led to some research funds on this area for me, where through this RAPS process, so watershed restoration and protection strategies, they've built in civic engagement as a key component of it. And so I think that's a way to get noticed, and that's a way to force, in a way, a lot of organizations and counties and cities to pay more attention to the social aspects. And I think, in the end, for me too, this was kind of a turning point where I was more focused on the biophysical aspects. And the biophysical aspects are great to answer questions like what. So what is the problem? Where is the problem? But I got really interested in the how. So how can we address this problem? And that's really all about people. And so I think there's a lot more recognition of that. And hopefully that kind of keeps growing more in the future. What are the other questions?
I guess I don't know a lot. I kind of like you were just discussing. I feel like I'm more in sort of like the hard sciences right now. So thanks for explaining how you sort of bridged that gap and started working on the social aspects more. I was just curious, how do you sort of prevent any type of biasing when you're asking questions that the responses are sort of in that like egotistical sort of, me first category? If you can explain.
Yeah. So I mean, with any survey, this idea of this social desirability, what it's called, is an issue. So people want to look nicer when they are reporting something to others. And one way to guard against that is assuring people of the confidentiality and anonymity of this whole process. And the other way is, the way we design questions and surveys. We follow the procedure of actually writing questions that are easy to understand, easy to answer. Don't ask two things at the same time. But then even with that, I think there is some of that kind of desirability where when they fill out the survey, in their head they might be thinking, I want to look more biospheric than egoistic. But when I look at the range of responses, I'm not too concerned about that, because you would expect to see a lot more people reporting as biospheric and it's not necessarily the case of you're either one or the other, and I think that really helps out with that process too. But there's other things you can do. People use like these scales that help measure how much social desirability people are trying to exhibit with the survey. But then I get concerned that people catch on to this social desirability scale, and then their desirability within the social desirability.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah.
You worked in the Mustinka River watershed.
Mm-hmm.
What was that?
So that was this Red River Basin stuff that I presented. Particularly in Mustinka, we did a lot of interviews. And so that was kind of a multi-year project where we did interviews, focus groups, and this broad survey in Wild Rice, River Watershed, and I think the second one was Mustinka. So try to cover the basin as a whole, but then for the survey focusing on particular sub-watersheds in the basin. Yeah, and I'd be happy to share findings and reports and stuff from there. Any other questions about this? question. All right, thanks so much.